Hi and welcome back to the AQA GCSE History Elizabeth I revision series. This is episode 5 and we're looking at poverty in Elizabethan England. So what caused poverty? One of the main reasons was due to the religious changes. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry VIII shut down England's monasteries and sold off the land. This was known as the dissolution of the monasteries. But these monasteries had been vital in providing support for the poor, ill, and disabled. The dissolution of the monasteries removed a valuable source of assistance for many people that needed it. Another reason was the population growth. In the 16th century, England's birth rate increased and the death rate fell. During Elizabeth's reign, the population grew from around 3 million to at least 4 million people. As a result, food production couldn't keep up. Prices rose and there were sometimes food shortages. Standards of living fell, rent increased, and the prices of essential goods rose dramatically. Thus, many people couldn't afford the necessities and fell into poverty. Another reason was agricultural failure. Subsistence-level farming is where you farm just enough to support your own family. However, this type of farming was very ineffective, and in the 16th century, landowners began to change their farming techniques to try and make more money. People no longer shared large fields, instead they were cut off to create larger, fewer farms. These new enclosed farms needed less labourers, so the farmers who rented the land were evicted. This left them unemployed and homeless. Farmers also realised that exporting wool to Europe was a lot more profitable, so less grain was produced. This was very bad as it meant food prices rose and many starved. Then there was a crisis point. In the late 1580s and the early 1590s, England suffered several failed harvests. This led to massive food shortages and even higher food prices, leading people into extreme poverty. Many starved to death. Traditionally, the main support for the poor came from charities. Rich and wealthy people made donations to hospitals, monasteries, and other organisations that helped the poor. But the poverty situation became so bad during Elizabeth's reign that these donations just weren't enough. Many realised that with so many people living in poverty, that society would suffer. The government feared that the rising levels of poverty were a serious threat to law and order. As poverty increased, there was an increase in crime, rebellions, and food riots. It's important to note there were 3 different types of poor people. There was the helpless poor, those who were unable to support themselves. This included orphans, the elderly, the sick, or the disabled. Then there was the deserving poor, people who wanted to work but were unable to find a job within their hometown or village. And then there was the undeserving poor, beggars and criminals and people who refused to work. Also, migrant workers were known as vagabonds. These were people who left their homes in order to find work elsewhere. Under the Poor Law in the 1590s, the undeserving poor were publicly whipped and forced to return to their own parish. The repeat offenders would be sent to prison. The undeserving poor were treated so harshly because they were seen as a serious threat to society. Many people believed that poor criminals and vagabonds had encouraged the Northern Rebellion, which happened in 1569. In response to the rebellion, the government introduced particularly harsh punishments for the undeserving poor in 1572. From the 1560s onwards, the government brought a series of poor laws to help and deal with the issue of poverty. Due to the fact that the voluntary donations were no longer enough to fund the poor relief, in 1560s the government introduced taxes. These taxes raised money for the poor and were known as the poor rate. In 1597 and 1601, further poor laws were passed into response of the poverty crisis in the 1590s. Under these new laws, the poor rate became a national system of compulsory taxation. It was collected locally by an official called the Overseer of the Poor. The poor rates were used to provide hospitals and housing for the elderly, sick and disabled. Poor children were given apprenticeships, which usually lasted around 7 years. The local authorities were also expected to supply financial support to workers and the deserving poor. It's also good to know that the Privy Council researched how local governments had tackled the problem of poverty. They based the national poor laws on the local policies that seemed to be most effective. For example, towns like London, Norwich, Ipswich and York had been using compulsory poor rates to pay for the poor relief since the mid-16th century. So that's the end of episode 5 of the AQA GCSE Elizabeth I revision series. Next episode will be on the Golden Age. Thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed. Please remember to like, subscribe and leave any questions in the comments below.